Hi, I'm Robert Joseph. Today I'm going to teach you how to make this wide sleeve Dolman style dress with an elastic waistband. Now I have two dresses here. One is the full size and the other is a half size. So in the video I'm going to be making this half size dress. However, all of the seam allowances and all of the hem allowances and binding widths are exactly the same. I shrunk the full size pattern down to a half size so that I could fit all the pattern pieces into the video frame, but everything else is the same except for the difference of the two views. So you have one view that has a straight skirt and the other view has a wider skirt for you. So this one is made out of a knit fabric, and if you're going to make the garment out of a knit fabric, please understand that I built the pattern for a woven which has 1/2 inch seam allowances. So for the knit, you'll need to trim off 1/4 inch of the seam allowances so that your garment doesn't come out larger than what you've expected. Most overlock sergers stitch at about 1/4 inch, so that's why you'll need to trim 1/4 inch of the 1/2 inch seam allowance off for the knit fabric. Also on the knit fabric, what I've done here with the hem is I've just turned the hem allowance up and I've stitched it down. Where on the woven here, I've actually turned it up and then rolled the hem into the hem allowance. And I did that using a crimping method. And to be honest with you, I probably crimped a little bit too much in the video. If you choose not to have a wide hem, like this comes out to be a finished 1/2 inch hem, go ahead and trim a 1/2 inch off and then turn up 1/4 inch and then one other 1/4 inch and then stitch it down. And that should be a very good hem for you. Other than that, these are basically two of the same garment. Another thing to know is that there are no pockets in this dress. However, if you want to add pockets, you would need to draft the pocket that would actually go in here, and I would suggest doing an inseam pocket. If you're unsure how to do that, I do have another video for the jumpsuit, which I go into detail in the video of how to install inseam pockets. A couple of things about the video before we get going. This is a really long video, and so I've put chapter markers below for you to skip ahead. However, I would like to advise you that if you do skip around in the video, you may be missing important and valuable information along the way. Another thing is, I'm not really big on voiceovers, so I'm narrating the video as I'm sewing and making the garment. So I know I get a little bit long-winded, but I'm really trying to bring you the most information I can to help you make your garment the best that it can be. And just one minor thing is that I no longer put background music in my videos. I was having too many issues with copyright claims on the music I was creating for my videos, so I just decided not to have music in the background. My only suggestion is for you to put on some background music for yourself while you're listening to me and sewing along. Now, if you've got your pattern ready and your fabric ready, let's start making this garment. Okay, so we're about ready to get started, but I want to talk about the pattern first. So the patterns that I'm using are half-size patterns. So I've shrunk them down half size, and that's so that I can get everything in the frame of the video. So because the pattern pieces are rather large, it's hard to get everything in here when I'm working on full-size patterns. And then I'll actually show, as you saw, I had it on the half-size dress form. So everything else is the same except that I'm using the half-size patterns. So the seam allowances are the same, which the general seam allowance on this is a 1/2 inch. I built this as a woven. However, you did see that I made one of the views a full size in knit. So if you're going to make this out of knit, just be sure that as you put it through the overlock machine, that you're allowing the knife to cut off 1/4 inch, and that will complete the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So the hem allowances are 1 inch, and I both have hem allowances on the sleeve. This is the bodice, the sleeve, and then the skirts. And today I'm actually going to be sewing view B, and I'm going to do a rolled hem on both the bodice and the skirt. So I'll show you how you can get a nice rolled hem with this fuller skirt area. For the knit, all I did was I turned up the inch and I stitched it down. So the other thing about the pattern that you really do need to know is that the binding for the woven needs to be cut on the bias because it's going around the neckline which has a curve. So the binding needs to be able to stretch a little bit and to roll nicely around that curve. So I'll refer to the fabric layout for how you can get this in your fabric, cut out of your fabric properly. And you'll see me do that today as well. So the other thing is that your elastic, I'm using, the pattern calls for a 1/2 inch wide elastic, and then refer to the pattern for the suggested amounts. So you can either loosen that or tighten that amount for your personal preference. Now, down here where the bodice meets the skirt, here there is a 3/4 inch seam. So, and that's to create a casing for the elastic. Now, if you can't find 1/2 inch elastic, maybe you found 3/4 inch elastic, you'll need to add another 1/4 inch to each side of these seam allowances. And then you'll need to make a 1 inch seam with that, and then follow the same instructions for creating that casing. Okay, so I'm using this fabric. It's a 100% rayon. It's actually very nice. It has a very drapey hand to it, and which actually aids to the drapiness of the design. So understand that this is kind of a difficult fabric to work with. If you have a fabric that maybe has more body. If you're a beginner, you may use something that has a little bit more body to it, which means basically a stiffer fabric. But of course, if you're going to use a knit, it's naturally going to have that drape. Okay, so today I'm not going to be using pins to pin the pattern to the fabric. I'm actually going to use some weights, and these are just regular weights, washer weights that I got at the hardware store. And I'm going to actually be cutting with my rotary cutter. Now, some people don't like to cut wovens with a rotary cutter, but it actually saves my hands. But of course, you can use a regular pair of scissors and pin if you prefer. So, and then I'm going to go back around the pattern and actually clip all of the notches that I need for sewing after I cut. So for my videos, what I like to do for the cutting is I like to speed up the cutting because you don't really need to see me take all that time to actually cut it out. So I speed the cutting up so you can just get the idea of how I'm laying everything out. I'm also going to be finishing my seam with an overlock, a 3-thread overlock. So I'll be pressing the shoulder seams open, one of them, and then the other I'll be pressing closed. And you'll see all of this, and I'll be guiding you the entire way. So I'm going to actually lay out my fabric and cut these pieces out now. Okay, so now that everything is cut out, we're first going to work with the bodice pieces. So I'm just going to move the rest of the stuff, these pieces, off of the table. And then there's my front, and there is my back. I'll take these two pieces, and I know that because I have a single notch here and a double notch here. So double notches are for the back. So now what we're going to do is we're going to open these up, and we're actually going to place these, match the front and the back bodice pieces, face sides together, and I call the right side of the fabric the face side because there's also a right and a left side of the garment, and I don't want to get confused. So face sides of the bodice together, and choose one of the shoulders to sew together. So I think I'm going to do this shoulder seam, and the reason we're only doing one is because we're going to apply binding and then stitch this other shoulder seam together after we do the binding. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin this together. And on this one, I'm pinning perpendicular from the outside so I can remove those pins. A lot of times I will actually pin in the direction of the sewing so I can pull those out. But because this is a fabric that, you know, is very drapey, sometimes pinning horizontally this way helps a little bit better. So I'm actually going to sew this. Again, this right here is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm using a straight stitch, and I'm going to be using 10 to 12 stitches per inch, maybe a couple more than that. I'm actually going to set my machine at 2.5. Okay, so before we begin, I have some tape on my machine, and there's a reason for that. So without getting in too much of a lengthy explanation, a lot of sewing machines now, their main position of their needle is way over here on the left, and I'll position that needle over there. So that's the standard position for this machine. So I'm not a real big fan of the needle here over on the left because I don't get equal pressure from the foot on either side of the stitch. So I like to start in the center where I'm getting equal pressure from the presser foot on either side of that stitch. So I just feel like I get a better stitch quality when I have the needle in the center. So the edge of this tape from the needle is my 1/2 inch seam allowance. So my main seam allowances on the Leslie Ann sewing patterns are a 1/2 inch unless otherwise specified on the pattern. So I'm doing 1/2 inch right now, and so that's why I have this tape. That's just for my guide. Now when I start this seam, I'm actually going to sew from the neckline to the edge of the sleeve. So the reason I like to start at the neckline is so that I don't get any weird stretching out of the neckline going this way. Remember, we're putting binding on this. So both of my seams will actually go from the neckline. So I'm going to sew this, and again, this is my 1/2 inch. When you start a fabric that is lightweight or has a mind of its own, I suggest not starting right at the edge, and I'll put this foot down, not starting right at the edge of the fabric. I always recommend going in a little bit, 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch, stitch and then back stitch and then continue with your seam. And the reason I suggest that is because sometimes when you start right at the edge, the machine won't always take it and your needle goes in, and what happens on the edge of the fabric sometimes is the needle will push the fabric down into that hole, and then it will cause a wadding effect, and then you'll have to pull it out or cut it out. So I always like to start with the fabric in past the needle just a little bit, 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 or 1/4 inch, and then back stitch to your beginning, and that will ensure that it will pull the fabric through evenly. So that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, so we've got this seam sewn. Let me clip up these threads. Now for this shoulder, I like to actually press my seams as I go, and I'm going to suggest to use a press cloth. So this is just basically a piece of cotton, 100% cotton muslin. So if you're using a synthetic like a polyester, then you're going to want to use a press cloth when you press your seams. Otherwise the iron will melt it. So I'm just going to lay this over that seam. By doing this, what you do is you set the stitches and it makes a really nice seam. And that's all it really takes. So what we're going to do, we're also going to press this seam open. So I'll flip this and lay this out and open up the seam. Get a nice flat seam there. And let's lay this press cloth over just kind of the beginning part to get this flattened. All right. And then I'm just going to press the beginning of that. And then it's easier for me to get this whole thing in there, laid in there right. So I'll press this. That's pretty good. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this seam on either side. I'm going to use the overlock. I'm using a 3-thread overlock, and I'm going to finish this seam. Okay, so just before I start, make sure that you just have that seam allowance, hold on to it, and push everything else behind it. So you just have that one layer of fabric. And then the way I like to start this, instead of just making the machine go and like pushing it under the presser foot, I actually like to lift the presser foot and push that fabric under the presser foot pretty close to the needle. And that way you're going to get an even pull. You're going to make sure that that fabric goes in there evenly. So I've got everything just the one layer. Be careful that there's no other fabric under there. And then we're going to go ahead and overlock this. Okay, so now that we have the shoulder seam all done and ready, I'm going to open this up and I'm going to keep it to the wrong side. So we want to see the wrong side. Okay, so we're going to put binding all the way around this neckline. So I've got my binding piece here, and this is, you know, it's cut on the bias so it stretches, and don't try to stretch it out before you sew it on because we're going to need that stretch as we walk it around the neckline. Now you won't really be able to pin this all in place because what's going to happen is we're going to start here, and then I'm going to need to kind of stretch this a little bit to get it to walk up to that edge line. So you're going to be matching your edges as you sew, and you'll see that this part here will be stretching. So that's what we're going to be doing. And we're going to be sewing this on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you need to readjust your machine for that, you're going to need to do that. So I'll show you that in my machine. So I'm just going to get it pinned here right at the beginning. And again, we're matching the face side of the binding to the wrong side of the garment at the neckline. So let's go over to the machine. Okay, so before I begin, remember I talked to you about my markings here, my tape. This is the 1/2 inch from the needle position at the center. Well, I need to actually use a 1/4 inch seam allowance now. And actually the edge of the presser foot here is not a 1/4 inch. It's slightly over that. So I actually need to gauge my needle in a different position. So I'm going to have to put it all the way over here to the left. So now that the needle is over to the left, if you remember, I said that there were notches here on my presser foot right here that are 1/8 inch apart. So there's 1/8 inch and another 1/8 inch makes it a 1/4 inch. Let me take this off so you can kind of see this up close here. So it's these little notches here that I'm talking about. So my needle is right here, and then this is 1/8 inch, and then this is another 1/8 inch. So this is where I'm going to have to match my fabric to. Okay, so I'm going to get my fabric in here, and I'm going to kind of line up the edge of everything that I've got. I'm going to kind of put my presser foot down here just for a second, just to make sure I'm lining it, and that looks pretty good. So I'm going to kind of push this up a little bit further just to get it started so the fabric doesn't disappear there into that hole. All right, and then I'll stick my needle down. Take this pin out. So that's going to be my beginning. Now you want to be really careful that you're not really stretching the garment side. And again, I've got the face side of my binding here to the wrong side of the garment at the neckline. So I'm going to get started here, and I'm going to actually sew this with a slightly smaller stitch. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to lower that to about a 2. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to make sure that as I'm stretching this, it's actually getting a good stitch join as I sew. So I'm going to get this started, and yet I will back tack just one. So I'm just going to get this started, and once I get past the seam allowance of the shoulder, I think I'll speed the video up. But I want to show you how I'm stretching the binding. So I'm going to get this started, and as I sew, I'm going to be matching the binding here to the edge of the neckline. And if I need to stretch that to match that curve, it's okay. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. So you will have to use your hands together as you go around this. So you see I'm stretching that binding to match the curve, but not too much. As we kind of curve around the neckline, you want to make sure that you're following that curve of the neckline. And you may have to do at some points just little by little as you're readjusting both the garment fabric and the binding. And again, try not to stretch that garment fabric out, just the binding. And I'm coming up to this seam allowance, and we want to make sure that the seam allowance is nice and flat. And again, I'll need to stretch this binding just a little bit, and we're going to curve around this neckline. And I've got this down. If you see something like this, what you can do is just lift up the presser foot and just kind of ever so slightly tilt it, and then you'll have a new angle to actually get that curve right at that shoulder line. Just go a couple of stitches, readjust. The one thing that you don't want is underneath here, you don't want to get any pleating or puckering. So I'm just passing that seam allowance now, following that curve. And I'm just going to go ahead and finish this up. Okay, so the binding is joined to the garment, and what I'm going to do really quickly, and I can do this without a press cloth, I'm just going to go in here and just kind of press that seam so those stitches are set in, just lightly. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this, not stretching it, but I want to lay this seam kind of flat, and I'm going to trim off about 1/16 of an inch all the way around. And I want to make, what I'm trying to do is I'm making this seam as even as possible while I'm doing that. So just a little bit, and just be careful not to trim underneath if there's any garment fabric underneath. Okay, so now that that seam allowance has been trimmed nicely, relatively even, and we're looking at about 3/16 now. And what I like to do is I like to lie it flat, make sure that I see that seam allowance, and then I'm actually going to press the binding over just lightly. Make sure that seam, you're pressing that seam up to the binding, and that seam allowance here underneath is actually going toward the binding. So I'm going to actually use my iron, and I'm just going to lightly press, and I actually kind of like to use a circular motion, pushing the binding away from the body of the garment so it lays nice and flat away. And I'm too far away from it, so I needed to reposition that. And I'm kind of holding the iron up so it's not lying flat on the garment, and I'm just using the tip of the garment, and I like to use this kind of circular motion to just kind of press that seam, and I'm pressing it away from the garment over that seam allowance. Because the next step is we're going to be working on the face side of the garment, and we need to have a nice crisp seam here for the next step so that it doesn't fold over and mess up our stitching. Okay, that should be good. So now I'm going to flip this over to the face side. And I'm going to kind of try to lie this neckline out kind of flat without stretching it out. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the cut edge here, and I'm going to match it to the cut edge of the seam allowance. So I'm going to start here at the seam line, the shoulder seam. And then I'm just going to go, and I'm going to just go along, folding this over and pressing the binding to match it to the cut edge of that seam, the binding seam. Make sure you get a nice crease there. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to take a little bit, and I'm going to press going away from that seam. You could start here and go all the way around. There's no particular reason why I'm doing it this way. I just like to. Maybe I'll try to fold this all the way up evenly, and I am stretching the binding just a tiny bit to match it to its counterpart at that seam. Right, we've got a good pressed edge here now. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take that and we're going to fold it over to cover that stitching. And I'm going to go ahead and pin it. So I'm starting here at the shoulder seam because that's the most stable part. And then I will actually just kind of work around folding that over. I want to make sure that I'm covering that stitching of the binding seam. And then I'm pinning it. And I'm hopefully, what we're looking for is a nice even binding. And I'm going to be top stitching this on. Just take your time. Again, I'm using a rayon, and this is a kind of a lightweight fabric, so it kind of has this mind of its own, and you really kind of have to work with these lightweight fabrics, these finer fabrics. You know, just take a little extra time to do all the prep work and the pinning. And this is actually the easiest way to actually put hand binding on any open area, neckline and arm line, or even to bind a seam allowance. Okay, so everything is well pinned, and so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stitch here, top stitch it about a 1/16 away from that folded edge, And the idea is that we're also going to get the stitch line here on the binding side as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to set my stitch length at 2.5. That's slightly longer than the stitching underneath here, and that's what we're actually looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and get this in the machine, and I'm going to go slowly, although I'll probably speed up the video for that stitching, but I'm going to take my time as I go around stitching this down. Okay, so now that the neckline binding is on and complete, and we've got it all stitched to the neckline very nicely, I'm actually going to press really quickly. My press cloth, I'm going to put it over that neckline because I just want to press that neckline. And then I will actually just trim off that extra that's up here. And we're going to finish the bodice. So I'm going to trim off this extra in the angle of that same seam line. And there's really not a whole extra here, but I'll just clean this up. OK, so now I can actually flip this over again, just like I did with the first shoulder seam. I'm going to match the front and back bodice at the shoulder. And I will pin this together. And again, I still like to stitch from the neckline out so that there's not any weird stretching happening. Sometimes if you stitch into the neckline, it will push the fabric and then it will make it stretch in toward the neck, so I don't want to do that. And I'm probably going to have to stitch on this other side, so that's why I did these pins this way. That's OK. I'll just put one more pin in, and then I'm not going, no, maybe I will. So I'll just do really quickly. I'm doing my 1/2" seam allowance. I'm going to press it open, and I'm actually going to overlock these seams together. And the reason I'm overlocking these seams together instead of pressing them open is because what we're going to do is we're actually going to press the entire seam toward the back, and then we'll just tack it down there. So I'm going to, what I'll do is, without talking, and I'll probably speed it up, 1/2" seam allowance, overlock the seams together, then back to the straight stitch machine, and I'll guide you through tacking this shoulder seam. Okay, so I'm actually going to clean finish this neckline at the shoulder. And you saw that I did not cut off this extra long thread here from the overlock. And the reason for that is if you cut it off, then you take the chance that it's going to unravel, and then your seam will not look pretty. So I like everything to look pretty. So I'm actually going to fold it over to the back side. And how do I know what the back side is? Well, if I can get this in here. So the back side is always higher at the neckline than the front. So I know that this here, if I fold this over, this is the back side. Now I'm going to do this all in one stitch, but normally I do it in two. So I've folded this over to the back, and usually I tack it here to the seam allowance. But now what I'm going to do, instead of tacking that, you could do that. And sometimes I normally do that in my videos, but I think you can handle this all in one. So again, I'm pulling the extra overlock thread over the seam allowance toward the back, and then I'm going to fold the back seam allowance toward the back so it's nice and flat, and that is tucked underneath here. And then what I'm going to do on the face side, fold that out. Let me get that tucked a little bit better. All right, there we go. I got some extra sticking out there. So I folded that over, right? So that the seam allowance is now folded over to the back with the extra overlock thread over there. And then I'm going to fold this out to the front, and then I'm just going to take a top stitch right across here on the binding for a couple of stitches just to tack it down. So get this into the machine, and my buttons on my machine are all in the front, so I'm going to get that needle down and then put my presser foot down. And notice I'm not right here on the edge of it, I'm kind of in the middle of the binding. I'm actually just going to stitch and back stitch real quick. Okay, so now that this shoulder is all tacked on and finished, I can actually cut off this extra overlock. And I could have done that at the sewing machine too. So our next step is actually pretty easy. While we have our front and back matched together with face sides together, I'm going to match up these side seams. And I do have notches here to match, although if you just match the curves from the bottom of the waist to the hem on the sleeve, you're in pretty good shape. Now on this one, I like to press the seams open. So it just makes the fabric lay a little bit nicer, because I'm going to, when I put the skirt on, I'm actually going to press those seams open as well. So I just want to have everything going the same way. So now these underarm seams are going to be sewn using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to press them open, and then I'm going to run them through the overlock. And I'll probably speed that section up. Okay, so we've got our underarm side seams done, and they're pressed open and overlocked. And I just want to say that the reason that I want to press these open is actually to reduce bulk. So if you want to overlock them closed, just understand that you're going to have a little bit more bulk at those areas, especially when you put the elastic through the waistline here on either of the side seams. That's going to add to some weight where the elastic may not be able to elasticize very well. So before we move on to actually working on the skirt, since we have the bodice by itself, I actually like to hem the sleeves. So I like to actually kind of do the hems if we don't have other fabric to worry about. And this is just a simple hem here. Now you have an opportunity here to do one of two style of hems. You could just overlock the edges here, as I did with the knit garment. You could just overlock these edges, turn it up an inch, and then stitch it down. But like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'm going to do a rolled hem for the skirt to show you how to get that rolled in nice and clean. So I want to have the same type of top stitching and width of hems for the sleeves as I do have for the hem on the skirt, and that just keeps everything looking the same. So I'm actually going to press this up. And I have a pressing hem. This is a narrow pressing hem for getting inside of sleeves. Of course, I'm working on a half-size garment here, so the regular ham-shaped hem wouldn't work. It'll be too big. So I'm just going to kind of insert this here so that I can actually just press this over. Fold this over, and I've got my ruler. Just press this over. And then for the rest of this, I'll just go ahead and speed up the rest of my pressing. Okay, so now that we have this pressed up an inch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of unfold it, and I'm going to match this edge, the cut edge. I'm going to fold that in to where my press mark is, and then I'll simply fold it over. And then I can put a pin there. Now, I normally don't when I'm doing regular sewing without a camera on. I don't even pin it. I just fold it in as I go. But I want to show you how this is all getting done. Now, if this is challenging for you to do this type of folding, of course, you can press it over a ½ inch and then press it over a ½ inch again. Just be sure that all of these seam allowances are being folded the correct way. Okay, and we're just getting all of these edges folded in, and that everything looks even as we sew it along. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this one side, and then I'm sure you can manage to do the other side on your own. So now here is it's all pinned all the way around. Okay, so now I'm just going to stitch here right next to the edge of the fold and all the way around. And instead of back stitching when I come back all the way to the start, I'm actually just going to stitch right over my original stitching, and that will be enough. So I'm going to go do that right now. Okay, so our hems are done on our sleeves, our neck is done. Actually, the whole bodice is now done, so now we can switch out and work on the skirt. So I'm just going to set this aside for right now. And I'm going to bring in the skirt pieces. And remember, this one we're doing with the flare. And so we're going to do this the same way we did the bodice. We're going to match the back, which this is the back piece because I have 2 notches at the waist. So I will lay that face side up, and then I will match the face side of the front to the back. Okay, right here at the side seams, I'm going to match these notches, and all I need to do is stitch up my side seam on either side. So what I'm going to do is just that. So match the hems down here, up the side, and then we're matching up here at the waist. We can go ahead and sew both side seams, and you will see me do that. So get this other side matched. So I'm going to sew these again with a ½ inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew from the bottom. Let me get this back. Let me get this pinned. Just walk you through the sew real quick. Okay, so I'm going to sew from the bottom here up to the waist, ½ inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to come back here. I'm going to press the seams open, and I'm going to overlock them. So I'm going to do all of that, and then I'll be back here and we'll talk about the hem. Okay, so now that the skirt side seams have been sewn, pressed open, and overlocked, we actually, instead of matching it to the bodice, we're actually going to finish the hem. I like to work the hems with the least amount of fabric as possible to have to work around anyway. So we can put the hem in now. So I put this on the ironing board, and we're just going to actually turn this up an inch, but we're going to be really careful just to press on this area here, not the whole hem, because after we press that, we're actually going to be crimping this edge to be able to get it to fit into here, because the cut edge is much larger than the area that it's actually going into. So we're going to make this edge actually a little bit smaller to get it to fit in to the area we're actually hemming it to. So let's just go ahead, and I will press this up, and it is a curve, so you will have to not stretch, but you'll just have to work around this edge as you go. So I'm going to speed this part up. Okay, so now we're all pressed up, and I'm actually just going to go over to the sewing machine, and I'll show you a technique to get this to crimp in this area, because what's going to happen is it'll get crimped, and then we're going to turn on that stitching where that crimp is, and we'll fit it right in, and we're going to turn that in, and then we'll be able to stitch here on that edge. All right, so let's go over to the sewing machine. Okay, so we're going to actually crimp the edge. Here I have the skirt, the edge of the hem allowance. Actually, not the edge. We're actually going to be crimping in about a 1/2 inch because we're rolling it in to a 1/2 inch finished hem. So we're going to practice first. So I'm going to show you what this is on a scrap piece of fabric. So you're going to need your snips or a seam ripper, or you could just use your finger, but we're going to actually hold the fabric back here at the back of the foot from actually going off. So we're going to hold a little bit of it at a time, and then we're going to let go. So, and I've set my stitch length at 3.5. So I think that's a good length for this crimping. So you don't want to do a really small stitch. So, and I'm actually going to do it at a 1/2 inch because it's a whole inch hem allowance, and we're going to roll a 1/2 inch and then roll another 1/2 inch. So I'm going to crimp at a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to put this fabric in here. This is just a practice. And I'm going to put the needle down to start. And then I'm just going to put my snips back here. And I'm going to actually just hold the fabric from actually going away from the presser foot. And then I'm going to sew. And then I'll release after I sew about 2 inches or so. And then release the fabric at the back and then hold it again. You see how it bunches up back here? Let me raise the needle. The fabric bunches up back there, and that's what you want. And then once you have about 2 inches of sewing, release it, and then put your scissors back there, or your seam ripper or your snips back there, and then start sewing again another 2 inches. And then release, and then sew again. And release, and sew again. So let me take this out. Okay, and so we have this crimping effect happening, and what we're going to end up doing is we'll fold on that crimp line. It should be enough, and then we'll be able to fold it again to be able to get that hem in. Okay, so let's see, was at the end. Okay, so here was the beginning. So it's pretty well crimped. We should be able to actually get that roll right into the hem. So let's actually do it on the actual skirt. Okay, so I'm actually going to start on one of the side seams, close to one of the side seams. I'm going to do it at a 1/2 inch because that's going to actually be my fold line. And I'm going to go start with my needle down. I'm going to put the snips right behind here. I'm just kind of pushing up against the back of the presser foot, and then I'm going to have to watch and like guide the fabric with my other hand. Okay. Okay, so now that the hem is sewn in, and if you were paying attention, I didn't mention this, I forgot to mention this before, that I was stretching a little bit to make sure that everything was flat and went in there correctly. So now I'm going to actually give this a press. Okay, so things are starting to come together. So now we just need to attach the skirt to the bodice. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to turn the bodice inside out. And we're going to find the front pieces, just because I've got the front here. So this is the front. I have a single notch here, and I have a single notch here. So then this is the skirt. And I've got to find my front, and I'm going to, these are the fronts because I had to have single notches on either of the sides. So let me pull this down. And the way we're going to do this is the skirt is face side out, the bodice is inside out, and I'm going to insert the skirt through the neck up to the waist. Okay, and then once I get there, I can match the side seams, and I'm just going to do this kind of rough real quick just to get everything kind of attached because there's a lot of fabric here. There's one side seam, and then come over here to the other side seam, and remember we want to keep these flat, the seams flat open. Okay, and I can re-pin these and adjust these as we work this. Okay, so now I need to find those notches. So my skirt notch to my bodice notch, and this is the front again. So the front notches will match up here, and everything should fit very nicely. And then I'm gonna just kind of come around to the back, and I'm gonna match up my back notches as well. All right, and make sure that the cut edges are matching. And I'm just going to come over and I'm going to have a look-see at my seams here. Make sure the seams are matching. And I'll just pin that, re-pin that. And I'm going to check my other seam really quick to make sure that that is also matching. If I can get in here. Okay. Okay. Now remember, our seam allowance is 3/4 of an inch for this because we are actually putting 1/2 inch elastic in there. So when you match your seams, you're going to need to make sure that your pin comes up far enough. And this one probably is not. Just do that. Okay. And then maybe just put a pin there at the approximately the center front and the center back, just to make sure all your edges are together nicely. And then what we're going to do is we'll just go over to the sewing machine. We'll stitch these two together. I'm probably going to start at one of the side seams. Make sure that all of your seams are flat. I'll probably start here, and 3/4 seam allowance. And I'll show you how I'm going to mark that off on the machine. Okay, so just before I get started for stitching the bodice to the skirt, I need to mark off where my 3/4 inch line is. And remember, because I choose to sew in the center here, my markings here on my machine are off. So that's why I have this blue tape here. So this blue tape is actually 1/2 inch, my 1/2 inch. So what I can do is use a ruler, and of course, all I need to add here is another 1/4 inch to make it 3/4 inch seam allowance. So I have some red style tape. Now, of course, you could, if you're doing 3/4 inches a lot, you could actually just do a pen mark there. But I'm going to line this up here, and I'm just going to put this style tape down where that 1/4 inch is. And continue to go up there. Okay. I think that's pretty good. And I will probably remove this once I'm done, because I don't do a lot of 3/4 inch seams. Okay, so there's my 3/4 inch seam allowance line right up there at the edge of that tape. So I'm going to grab my garment and we'll go ahead and sew that. Okay, so that 3/4 inch waist seam is sewn. Now we're actually going to be turning this seam up toward the bodice. But before we do that, I want to trim off some of the bulk. So just on the bodice seam allowance, I'm going to trim that to about 1/4 inch. So I'm going to trim some of that off so that we don't have a lot of bulk. So it's just to the bodice side, okay? How am I going to do this? I'm right-handed, so I'm going to come in this way. And this is the bodice seam allowance. So I'm going to come in here, and just on that seam allowance, you see I'm leaving the skirt seam allowance alone, and I'm just trimming off about at least half of the bodice seam allowance. And be careful when you go around these seams that you don't actually catch any of the extra fabric. And then once this is trimmed, then we will run the skirt seam allowance edge through the overlock to clean finish it, and then we'll go ahead and press it up to the bodice. And there we are. So you can see now the bodice seam allowance is shorter than the skirt, and now we're going to run this edge, the skirt seam allowance, the bigger one, through the overlock. Okay, so now that the waistband is sewn and we've got the one edge overlocked, then we can actually turn this up to the bodice. And I'm going to pull the skirt out. So now we see the inside of the entire dress. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slip it into this pointed end of the ironing board. It's a little snug. I don't want to pull this out. But what we're going to need to do is kind of get in here and feel we're like folding this up to the bodice. And I'm going to go ahead and pin this. And let's see, which way am I going to do this? I think I'll pin this way. Right? And then we're going to gently work around, and using your fingers, feel on the inside to the outside that this seam is flush moving up, okay? Because you're going to need to actually sew on this side. We're going to sew the seam allowance down to the bodice. So this is why I'm pushing that up this way, and then I'll pin it. And as we sew in the machine, we will have to kind of work here and make sure we're not going to get any pleating. So I'm just simply going to continue working around, and it likes to stick to this ironing board that I have. So move that up there. Okay, that pinned. And then we want to make sure it's flush, because on this other side we don't want to have any gaping over of any of the fabric. So with your fingers again, feel that that seam is actually flush when you're moving it over. In this one, and then we're actually going to stitch this down, and we're going to stitch it down right here about in the middle of the overlocking width, kind of right where I'm pinning. Okay, one more pin here. Okay, so now that I've got this all pinned up and we're about ready to sew it, I'm going to actually find the back, and this is the back. And the reason that's important is because we need to leave a space open to actually insert the elastic. So what I'm going to do, and I don't want to do it here on the seam because that's too thick, that's too much business going on there. So I'm actually just going to go about 1 inch away from that, and I'm going to kind of put a vertical pin there, and then probably 2 to 3 inches. I think 2 inches is probably good enough opening, right? So I'm going to leave this space open. And I'm going to do this in the back because I don't really want it to be noticeable on the front. And so, you know, hopefully we won't even know that it's there because we're going to stitch it closed, but we're going to leave it open. So when I go into the machine, I'm actually going to start here, and then I'll sew all the way around, and I'll stop here. And I really don't need to back stitch because we're going to come back after we've inserted the elastic, and we're just going to stitch this closed, okay? So let's go over to the machine and get this stitched. Okay, so the seam allowance has been stitched up, and we can just have a real quick look at the stitching on the other side. That's all right. Now there's going to be elastic, so it'll be kind of scrunchy. So this is the back, this is the opening, so we just need to insert the elastic and feed it through the waist tunnel. So I've got my elastic here. I'm going to take a big safety pin, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to pierce the end of it. And the way I like to do it is I just kind of like to weave the piercing in and out of the top of the elastic, and then go ahead and close that, and now that's on there secure. So I'm actually just going to insert this here, and I'm just going to kind of push it through and kind of pull. And so what you'll end up doing is you're going to, I don't know what the right word is, shimmy this or move it through. So here's the top of the elastic. So hold on to, the top of the safety pin, hold on to the end of that safety pin and just push that fabric through all the way till you can't push it anymore. And then you take the other hands and like pull that fabric onto the elastic. And you'll just continue to do that all the way through. Now, once you get to these side seams, you might have to do a little wiggling just to get past that seam allowance, because it may be just blocking you a little bit. There it is. So you just have to feel your way through that just to pierce through that. Okay? And then as you're going, make sure that try to keep an eye on the end of the elastic here, that it doesn't disappear into the tunnel. Otherwise, you're going to have to feed it through again. So just continue feeding this through. Okay. And then also, as you're going along, I kind of like to stretch the elastic and just kind of feel and make sure that it hasn't twisted on me as I've been moving this through. Sometimes it will do that. So once you get a bunch in one spot, like on the side seam, just kind of hold onto the elastic at one point and then just kind of pull on that to get some of this other fabric to move along the elastic. If you put too much in one space and then you keep going around, you take the chance that it's going to twist. Now I'm coming up to another side seam, so I'm just going to have to feel here which way the head of that safety pin, where it needs to go. There we go. It went through. That one went okay. And we're back at the starting point, but I just want to come around here and I want to make sure that, again, that the elastic is not twisting around. Okay. It feels pretty flat, pretty good. So I'm going to actually pull this. There's the safety pin. So I'm going to just kind of pull it a little harder. Be careful. I think I pulled it too much and it kind of went skinny. And it may have twisted. See if I can feel that move some along here. Once you actually do elastic a little bit, once you get more experience, if you're not experienced already, you'll get the feel of it. Okay. So I'm going to pull that. Whoops, I don't want that to go back inside. So I have enough here that I can actually stitch it closed. And I'm just going to feel one more time, feel around that there's no twists in here, that it's all flat and it's all going the same way, all the way through. Okay, so that's good. So it's going the same way. So I'm going to pull out this. And now I want to lap this over. I want to make them flat. Okay. So I want to make sure that they go in the same way that they were going in. Be careful that you don't get it twisted like that. So this is the way it should be. And I have it so I'm overlapping about a ½ inch. So each of these sides should have a mark on them. And I didn't really bring my pen over, but I've got a pencil here. So I'm going to mark here on this side. There's a ½ inch. And then on the top of this side, there's a ½ inch. A pencil is fine. Nobody's going to see it, and it won't show through. So right on top of each other. And I can take a pen, not a pen, but a pin. And I'll just pin those together. And now all I need to do is stitch straight down. Now if you want to hold on to these other ends, you can actually stitch these other ends too, but I'm not going to worry about it for right now. I'm just going to run this through the machine real quick. Okay, so my elastic is all stitched together, and I'm just going to clip these threads A little bit tighter. Now you could also kind of stitch these down, but I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference for right now. So now we need to get this to disappear into that casing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of pull a little bit on this elastic area and kind of magically kind of maneuver some of this fabric around, right? And so this elastic will disappear into that casing. So move some of that extra fabric around. And then what we're going to do, I'm going to put this back into the machine. And actually, I want to kind of see if I can move the elastic. Whoops, there's an extra thread. Get it to move what I want to say is I want this seam to actually move a little bit a ways from this opening. So if I can get some of this fabric to kind of move that way, that would be nice. Just kind of tug on this to get it to move over that way. And then you can kind of pull on this, right? And let's have a look here where I want to stitch. Okay. So I'm going to actually have to stretch this. We're not stretching the fabric, we're just stretching the elastic so that we can stitch this little opening closed. And right where I have the pin there is the top of the elastic. So we just don't want to stitch that elastic. So that's why I was trying to actually move some of this fabric around the elastic, because I really want that stitch line to not be where I'm stitching because there's a lot of thickness, okay? So I think that's going to be okay. I'm going to get this back into the machine, again, like we originally stitched it on. At that opening, I'm going to have to kind of pull the elastic, and then let me put a pin here so you can see where I'm starting and ending. This is where I ended when I came around to stitch up the casing area. That's what this is called, a casing, and this is where I started. So I need to stitch at least between those two pins. Okay, so I'm going over to the machine. Okay, so we got that closed up. That was actually the last step. So let's turn this face side out, and we will have a look at this. These sleeves to come out. All right. So now this is the front, and if you just kind of pull on it like this, sometimes that helps the elastic kind of move around. Let's clip some of these extra threads. Just kind of pull a little bit. Don't pull the fabric apart. So this was the back, and this is the front. Okay. And there is your wide sleeve Dolman elastic waist dress.